Let's talk about layers in AutoCAD. The first thing we need to do is open an AutoCAD drawing. And what I want to do is make sure that the units, I'm going to type units to get my setup. Make sure mine show up as millimeters, centimeters, decimeters, or feet and inches. There's probably an option in yours that is called decimal. So we want to select that. I'm going to select millimeters, because we can use uh, decimals of millimeters. So 1.1 millimeters or 1.1111. And I'm going to make my precision of 4 because some of this homework is set to 4 decimals. I'm going to make sure my angles are set to degrees, minutes, and seconds. There'll be an option here rather than decimal degrees. I think that's the default for most decimal templates. And the precision is degrees, minutes, and seconds. You can cut it to just degrees or minutes, seconds, fractions, or decimals of a second. But I'm just going to go to this level here. The rest we don't need to worry about. And you can save that as default for this drawing or for AutoCAD. But in this case, we don't want to do that. Then layers. If you remember, or if you paid attention, we've only used layer 0, and there will be possibly just one layer called layer 0, and this depth point layers may not exist in your drawing just yet. Layer 0 is the default AutoCAD layer. You cannot erase it, change the name, you cannot delete it, and it's not recommended that you draw in layer 0, and that's where we're going to create our own layers. Layer depth points is another default layer by AutoCAD, and it's used for things that you don't intend to print, mainly things that you can use as reference. This little window tells you what layer you're on. I'm on layer 0. The color of the layer, its status. Right now it's unlocked. It's thawed, so not frozen, and then it's on. And then in your AutoCAD, you'll have a button. I think is larger, and it's called Layer Project. Layer Properties. If you hover over the buttons, you'll find the one that's Layer Properties. It opens a bigger dialog box for layers, and it shows us here the name of the layer, layer 0, the layer depth points, the status. This check mark here tells us this is the current layer, the layer I'm drawing on, the color, the line type, the line weight, and description, other descriptions, whether this layer prints or not. By default, you cannot change the layer depth points. If I can click here, you see how it's grayed out. That's not an option. I can make this layer. Right now it prints, now it doesn't print. So you can make any other layers. We need 4 layers. The layer object, for the purposes of our drawing, is the layer we're going to draw our things on. Then there's a layer called reference that we're going to use to draw our reference lines. Things like the center of circles, axial lines, like the center of that flange, and things like that. Then we're going to have a layer called annotation, which is where we're going to put all our text. And the final layer is going to be dimensions, where we're going to put all our dimensions. So we have to create those 4 layers. There's 3 ways of creating layers. There is up here on these buttons, there's one that's called new layer. And AutoCAD kind of predicts what you want. So if I'm on this layer, the current layer is 0. If I create a new layer, it creates a layer that's identical to it, except with a different name. So that's one way to create a layer, new layer. The other way is to highlight the layer you want to emulate, right click, and on the list of things, there's one called new layer. I'm going to click new layer, and as I mentioned, it's going to create a layer very similar to layer 0 right below it. It's called layer 1 by default. I want to change that to object, and I'm going to hit enter. I am happy with the color, I'm happy with the line type, and I'm happy with the default line weight. And we're not going to play too much with the default weights right now. And you can change the description. By default, AutoCAD describes it as the thing you named it, but you can come over here and make your own description. This is the layer where we draw objects. That's a description for you internally. And I'm going to make this window a little bigger so that we can see that description. So that's the description that you can give your layer so that the next person who uses this drawing can look here and say, oh, okay, this is where we're going to draw our objects. If I'm satisfied that I've created enough layers, I can exit out of here. And notice that layer 0 is still the active layer. If I want to switch to a different layer, I click on this pull down and I want to change to layer object. And now everything that I do is going to be on the layer that shows up here. That's one way of changing layers. The other way is if we click on the layer properties button, and there is the check mark is on layer object. I believe if you double click, it makes the layer you double click on the current layer. And you can also select a layer and then hit this button here that is called set as current. If I click on that, notice that the check mark will not be on layer object. I'm going to do that again. I'm going to make the layer def points active by doing that. I'm going to click on it. Notice the check mark moved there. And when I come out here, left layer def points is the one that is active. I'm going to click on layer object and make that the current. And sure enough, and so I can start drawing my figures. But I'm not really done creating layers. Remember, I'm going to go back to layer properties. Remember, I need four new layers. The layer object, the layer annotations, the layer reference, and the layer dimensions. So let me just start making those layers. I'm going to right click on object and select new layer, and it gives me the next layer. I'm going to call it annotation. And I'm going to change some things about it. And I'm going to keep it on. I'm going to keep it thawed. I'm going to keep it on lock. I'm going to change the color. I'm going to make my annotations magenta color. Let me go back to this. So if you want to change any of these properties, forget the first three, on, freeze, and lock. Those are toggle switches, either on or off. But if I want to change the color, I will click on the color, and then a color wheel will show up. There's three tabs there, and you can select it that way. But you just want to go to the index, and normally you would just use the colors 1 through 9 here. If there's a color here that you like better, you can select it. And if you select it, here's things right here in the index color, right above. This is color 3, color 4. If you see right above, the numbers changing. And if I go way up here, you see the colors are changing also. I think there's a total of 252 colors, maybe more. Anyways, you can select any of these. I'm going to select magenta for my annotation, and I'm going to click here and hit OK. And now I notice that the color for the annotation is magenta. Because it copied the layer that's active, it still copied its nodes. Well, this is not the layer where we draw objects. This is the layer where we put text. You don't have to do this description. It's not critical to the function. This is just a note for you or the next person using this drawing. Because you may say this drawing and send it to somebody else in the real world scenario so they can do some work on it. The next layer I'm going to create is the layer dimensions. I'm going to right click on, no, I already did it that way. I already right clicked on object and created annotation. I'm going to do add a new layer here. No, correction, here, new layer. A new layer shows up. It just copy the last one I created. I'm gonna make that layer dimensions. Maybe just like the other layers, but I'm gonna make my dimensions blue, the light blue, color 4. If you know the name of the color, you don't have to click on it or the number. You can just click 4 and notice it will give me that. It's called the blue, but AutoCAD calls it cyan. The light blue calls it cyan. The dark blue it calls it blue. I want the light blue. Reason I'm selecting the light blue is because my screen is black. If I select the dark blue, it's going to be harder to see. If you work in white, I recommend that you use the dark blue. But I'm going to use the light blue, also called cyan. And notice that right now I haven't changed the line type. Okay, the next layer will require me to do that. I'm going to create a new layer, and so that's going to be my reference layer. This is where I'm going to draw reference lines. I want this to be green, so I'm going to click on the color, and when I say green, I mean number 3 green, not any of these other greens here. If you like something better, that's fine, but for our purposes, I'm going to stay with the green here. I'm going to click OK. The only thing that's different besides the color is the line type. I want to use a line type called center line for the line type of this layer. So if I want to change the line type, I'm going to click on here, and perhaps your drawing won't have anything but the continuous. And let me just set mine so it does the same thing. So that's the only thing that shows up. There's a command in AutoCAD. This is for your reference called purge. It deletes anything in your drawing that you're not using. And if I click on line types here, there's those 3 line types that are right now not being used by anything. I'm going to delete them all. And that's so now I see that there's a whole bunch of things here that are no being used at the moment. Like the layers that I created, annotation, dimension, and reference. There's no objects on it, so I could delete them because they're not being used. But I'm just going to leave that. Anyways, so back to layer properties. If you remember, I want to make the reference layer the line type. If I click on line type, you should look like this. There should only be one line type called continuous. AutoCAD has several line types, but it doesn't load into your drawing until you either create a template that has them all or until you load it yourself. So I'm going to load a line type from the AutoCAD list. And remember, I want one called center. Now, just about every line type has three levels. It's the normal size, the half size, and the double size. So I'm going to select center, just center, and click OK. Now on my list of line types, my reference layer still has line type continuous. I want to change it to center and hit OK. So notice as soon as I hit OK, this will change to center. And there it is. So now my reference layer will use color green and a line type called center. This is one way to load line types inside of the layer manager, layer properties manager window. The other way to load line types, because sometimes you want to use a line type that is not necessarily associated with that layer, you can load it separately. I'm going to just start typing line type, and if I click here, notice it will have the center and continuous. That's the 2 line types that I'm using, so I can load additional lines. The one I want to load is one called hidden. Remember, just normal, half size, and double size. I'm going to load that line type called hidden. Hit OK, and now it will appear in my list. And we'll use that line type in a minute for hidden geometry. Okay, so now I can start working. I'm going to draw exercise 1A using what I just did here. The first thing I need to do is going to draw my object. So I want to make sure that I'm on the layer called object. If you're not on that layer, if something other than object shows up here, like right now it shows up layer 0, you can click on the dot of the pull down menu and make sure you select the layer object. So before you start, make sure that you can read here object. And so that's our layer. Our first exercise, it's a circle within a box. I don't have the dimensions, but I'm going to draw it. You'll use the dimensions as given, because you're going to have to, later on, you're going to have to put dimensions on your drawing. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle. Rectangle. I'm going to set the origin to 0. I'm going to start the drawing at 0, 0, hit enter, and then I'm just going to draw my rectangle. You can enter the x and y coordinates of the second point up here. I'm just going to freehand it and put it there. So there's my rectangle. Okay. Then I'll have to draw a circle inside that rectangle. That is, the diameter is the same as the entire height of the rectangle. So that's pretty simple. I'm going to draw a circle, and I'm going to come over here and make sure, but it is, if you notice, AutoCAD found the center of my geometric shape. If you don't know how to do that, you come over here and you snap, object snap settings, and make sure that geometric center is selected, and it is in my case. So I'm going to continue drawing my circle, and I know that the circle is as tall as the box. So all I can do is drag that either perpendicular to my center or to the midpoint. That's what that triangle stands for. That's the midpoint of the top line of the circle. So if I click here, it puts my circle exactly as tall as my box. That is the gist of my object. That's all my object is, a circle inside a box. The next thing I need to do, the next thing I want to do is put a reference line that shows me the center of that circle. Well, I don't want to draw it on the layer object. So I'm going to make sure I switch to layer reference, and I'm going to draw a line that passes through the center of the circle. So I'm going to start at the top or the midline of that, the horizontal line of that square, or that 12 o'clock quadrant, from here to here, and hit enter. My geometric shape is too small that the line type doesn't show up. I'm going to make this a little bigger. I'm going to scale it up, maybe by a factor of 10. So it's 10 times bigger until my line type shows up. It should show up on yours. Here we go. There was a setting inside AutoCAD that made my lines too big. What I'm going to do is make my reference line just slightly bigger than my geometric shape. So it tells me, because it extends past the object, that it tells me that it's not part of the object, but it's part of the geometry, or it's our reference line. I want to make sure this is my OCD. I want to make sure the midpoint of that line, it's also in the center of that circle. So I'm going to pick up its center of grip and move it so it's in the center of that circle. And I'll do that in a minute. It'll be easier to do it later. So then I'm going to put another reference line across the circle. And I want these center of these two lines to intersect in the middle. First, I'm going to extend this line past the geometry. And then I'll make sure that the center line of the two lines are in the intersection, which also happens to be the center of the circle. And this is my reference line. That tells me this is a circle, and that tells me that that's the center of it. Next thing I want to do is put dimensions. But let's just assume for a second that you drew a line, you wanted to draw a reference line, and you notice here it's on the wrong layer. This one's on layer. If you click on something, right now I'm working on layer reference, but if I click on something that's not on that layer, it will tell me here what layer it's on. So if I click on this, it should be layer object. If I click on it, layer object, if it's on the wrong layer, all I have to do is pull the pull down menu and click on the layer I want it to be. See, if I hover over reference, or over dimensions, over layer depth point or annotations, AutoCAD will give me a preview of what's going to happen if I do click. I don't want to change this one because that is part of my object, but I accidentally drew this line on the layer object when it should be, I'm sorry, on the layer 0 when it should be on the layer reference. There's two ways of changing that. I can highlight it, do my quick layer window and select the layer I want it to be on, and it's there. I'm going to hit undo and reverse that. The other way of doing it, highlighting this, typing properties, and it gives me the properties of this line. It's color by layer, it's on layer 0, and the light type is by layer. I want to change the layer to layer reference. That seems like a longer way. This would be a quick way to do it. You just click on layer reference. So one more time, if I want everything that I select here to be on layer reference, this goes blank because now there are things on more than one layer. But if I want it all to be on layer, say annotation, I click here, and then now everything's on layer annotation. So if you put something on the wrong layer, you can always take it back. I'm gonna hit undo until my object looks the way it's supposed to. These two things are on layer object, and then these two things are on layer reference. Third, we want to put some dimensions on here. Let me put the dimensions. So I would switch from layer reference to layer dimensions. Say you forgot that. Go to annotate tab. I'm going to tell you how to fix it one more time. Annotate. There's two dimensions we want to use. The linear dimension, which gives me the X and Y component. So it gives me the distance in the horizontal and the vertical. I'm going to give this, and I can select the points. I want to measure from this corner to this corner, and I can pull my dimension as far as I need to be. So what I did wrong here on purpose is I made that dimension on the layer reference. One more time, if I want to change it, I highlight it on layer reference. If I change it to layer dimensions, it will change the color and line type. So that's the dimension of my object. Remember, this dimension is something that, because I freehanded this box, yours will be the same size as the example in the book. And when I'm finished with something, I'll hit escape twice. Notice that even though I changed the layer of this dimension to dimensions, I'm still working on the layer reference. And I will continue working on that until I change it. So I'm supposed to be working on the dimensions layer. I'm going to come over here and click on dimensions, and now I'm working on the dimensions layer. And I'm gonna put another dimension on it. That is the vertical dimension of my box. 168, right? That's the bottom, top to bottom dimension. Now the last thing I'm gonna dimension is the dimension to the center of the circle from the bottom. Vertical dimension. That will give me its radius. And I will use the same. I can measure from here to this corner, and if I drag it up and down, it gives me the horizontal. If I drag it left to right, it gives me the vertical. Okay, so it just gives me distance in the x and distance in the y axis. If you do some quick math, you will notice that 84 is half of 168. So we are correct when we say that we're halfway up. So no matter what points you select, as long as you're selecting linear dimension, it gives you the same. From here to here, I still get the same 84.4. in the vertical. If I measure from this corner to this corner using linear dimension, and I pulled it, and if I pull it to the right, I'm still just going to get the vertical. I'm going to erase these two. Now, if I want to get the actual dimension from this corner to this corner in a straight line, not this vertical component, then I'm going to use something called the align dimension. Okay, so it would measure the line between this point and that point. So I click here and I click here, the center, and now it gives me the length between those 2 points. And I can stretch it as far as I want so that it's not crowded. So that means the distance, if there was a line between this point and that point, that's the length of the line, 129 units. I think there's some cases where you'll need that in some of the exercises. So that's the so there's an annotate tab possibly out here in your drawings, but if you can't find it, go to the annotate tab and look at the dimensions part of it. Linear, angular. The other dimension you want, I'm sorry, linear and align. You may also want to measure the dimension of 2 angles. And let me draw something with an angle. Looks like 30 degrees. If I go back to the annotation and the angular dimension, all I have to do is select both lines, and then there's a dimension of angle. I guarantee you that this is probably not a precise 24-degree angle, but the settings in my dimensioning style is set to just degrees. And if I want to verify, I can just double click on this. Or I'm just click on it and type properties. And somewhere on here, I'll be able to find out the precision of my angles. It's not critical at this point. I think the angles we're going to draw and measure are going to be whole angles. So this will work just fine. We also talked about match properties. In reality, I should have drawn this in the object layer. And the dimension will stay in the dimension layer. Another way to change in that, it's a button called match properties. It appears here on mine. I think on yours will appear in this vicinity somewhere. But if you hover over something, somebody says it looks like a Game Boy. So match properties, it tells me, okay, what do I want to emulate? That's the first question, source object. I want to emulate this. And then it tells me destination objects. What objects do I want to look like this? So I want my 2 lines to look like this. Somehow, it selected the dimension as well. So I kind of didn't realize that this dimension was overlapping my objects. So I'm going to do the match properties again, and I'm going to select another dimension and make this angular dimension match its properties. And that is match properties. And the last thing, we're close to the end here. The other dimension, I'm going to go to my annotate tab, and I'm going to measure. If you look at the circle, there's 2 things you can measure, the radius or the diameter. So let's start with radius. If I click on the circle, it should be 84.4, blah, blah, blah. And there we go. It gives me an arrow pointing at the circle. It tells me R for radius, and it gives me the radius of that circle, which is the same distance as halfway up. The next one is diameter. I'm 100% sure that it will be this number because the height of this box equals the diameter of the circle. So if I click on the circle, it'll give me the symbol for diameter, and it will give me the diameter of that circle. So those are how you put dimensions on vertical and horizontal dimensions, align dimensions, angular dimensions, and the dimensions of circles. If you do an ellipse, let me just see what, I'm going to just draw an ellipse here at random. And if I want to annotate, it won't give me that dimension because it's not a circle. I won't be able, because it doesn't know what to pick. The radius is ever changing, so you cannot do it on an ellipse. You'd have to you would actually have to give me a linear dimension this way and a linear dimension this way. So that's the radius, the minor radius, and the major radius. Again, my ellipse should be in layer object, so let's put that on the layer object for practice purposes. And there it is. Now, the last thing, let's assume that this ellipse here is a table. It's an oval shaped table. That has some base. Let me offset that this ellipse from like this distance. So I'm going to offset it to the inside. And let's just say that's the base of the table. The thing about it is, if we're looking at it from the top, we won't be able to see the feet of the table or the base of the table because the top of the table obscures it. But we do know that this geometry exists. It's just hidden. So what I need to do is change the line type to the hidden line type. I'm going to select that that object, and I'm going to go to I'm going to type properties. I keep typing properties because I haven't been able to find the button, or you may not have been able to find the button on your computer. If you have it, it looks like a Game Boy without the brush. But if I'm going to click here, I can change by default. It's it puts the line type that we use for layer. I can force that line type to be something else. I'm going to force it to be a hidden line. And now the geometry that's obscured by the tabletop, I can see it. It's part of the layer object. It's just not solid because it's hidden. And that's where we assign it a hidden type. You'll do that on the flange for sure. If you remember, and I'm going to try to draw that flange real quick with not knowing any dimensions. That's sort of the flange. I think the pipe, there's a pipe here. There's a pipe there. There's a pipe thickness of some thickness here on both sides. And then there's a flange. I'm going to draw a rectangle here, from here to here. And it's not centered. The first thing I want to do is draw me a reference line that goes through the center of the pipe. And I'm going to stretch it this way. And I'm going to move my flange so that it's centered. The middle of that flange passes through the middle of that axis. And the flange is actually the same size as this. So I'm going to draw me another reference line that I will delete later. But first I'm going to mirror it to the other side. And I'm going to stretch my flange. Now, if I know the dimension of this circle, I don't have to know the dimension of this flange because it's the same. I would just stretch it this way and this way. I know that my flange is symmetric, so the distance from this to the center of the circle is the same distance as the other side. So I can just mirror this about the center of the circle, and that's my other flange. It looks a little out of shape. It doesn't necessarily look like yours did because I'm kind of drawing it freehand, not knowing the dimension. But I'm going to use this extend command to extend these lines. Extend, this is my extend edge, and I'm going to extend these lines that way. That reference line and that reference line I don't need. I do need a reference line that goes through the center of that circle. This way. And there it is. You want ticks to be in the center. So you want these, and I'm just dragging them here because I'm a little OCD. I want the center of this bullseye to be in the center of the circle. That's my flange. The things that I was trying to emphasize is that these lines, although they exist, they're obscure because that's the inside of the pipe. So I want to change that. I want to go to the properties and I want to change that line type to hidden. So now we know there's some lines in there that we just don't necessarily see unless we're looking through this hole that way, just like we are here. We also know that we're looking through this hole, but this pipe, this flange is attached to, has a thickness of this dimension. And I'm going to offset that way. This line is also hidden. So let's use the match properties. I want this line to remain on the layer object, but have the line type hidden. So I'm going to select my source object. So everything I touch after this one will have the same properties. It will have forced, we will have forced this line type onto that object. Because anything on the layer object, and I'm going to switch to layer object, anything I draw will have its default line type of continuous. I'm going to draw a circle here for reference. See? Because if we look at the properties of it, it will want to draw a layer line type and color by layer. Unless we specifically change that, but we're not going to bother with that. We'll learn that later. The only thing that's different here is actually part of the outside of the pipe is actually obscured by the flange. So this length here needs to be another line, and we cannot make a part of a line a different line type. The entire object has to be on the same, have the same properties. So it's either continuous where we see it or it's hidden where we don't see it. Well, what we're going to have to do is create 3 lines, 3 segments. This segment is going to be continuous, this segment is going to be hidden, and this segment is going to be continuous. So how I'm going to do this is by trimming it. I'm going to trim the line that is continuous, and I'm going to trim the part that is not going to be continuous out of the way. Use my circle. I'm going to go to trim, use my circle as my trimming edge, and I'm going to cut that off. Cut that off. And the reason I did that is because now all I have to do is draw one line here to here and here to here. The only thing is it doesn't have the correct line type, so I can either highlight the line, type properties, or click on the properties button and change the line type to hidden. And so notice now that that segment of that line is hidden. There's 3 lines. When you print it on paper, it'll look like one line, and that part of it will be hidden. I got to do the same thing here. I'm going to use a different method, the match properties method. If you can't find the button, if you don't know what the thing is, AutoCAD kind of changes the look of some of the buttons from version to version. If you notice my offset button, it looks a little different than your offset button, perhaps in newer versions. The match properties might look a little different, but I think it sits around here. Just hover over something that looks like what it is you want, and then AutoCAD will tell you what it is. So I'm going to go to match properties. I know that I want this line to look like that line. So I want to select first the source. This is my source. This is my destination. Before I click AutoCAD, it gives me the preview of what's going to happen if I'm satisfied with the result. I'm going to click on it. And there's my flange. I think, let's see, let me go to the Annotate tab. Well, first let me go back and change dimensions. And then I'm going to go to Annotate tab and put some quick dimensions on this. There's the height of the flange, which is also the diameter of the circle. There is the inside diameter of the pipe. There's the outside diameter of the pipe. And it's a little, even though the dimension is shown here, because it just won't fit in the middle, AutoCAD doesn't want to force it in there. Diameter of the outside is 26, diameter inside is 21. Thickness of the flange, all those are horizontal or vertical dimensions. The thickness of the flange is that dimension. Oh, and I think the last thing I need to know is the length, perhaps the length of the flange. And that's all the dimensions. The last thing we didn't do annotation is I'm gonna go either multi-line text or single line text. Let's do single line text. The first thing that it asks us for is the text height. For some reason, it wants to go to 5.0800. That's probably something that the last thing was done. I'm gonna try that. So specify the start point. I'm gonna want it to start here. It has a height of 5.08. Let's change it to 1 and see what happens. I'm gonna type 1. If it's too small, I can change it. And then it asks me the rotation angle. I want it to be 0 because I want it to sit horizontal. I'm gonna hit enter, and then it says, all right, start typing. This is example 1. And oh, well, it's too small. It showed me what it's gonna say, but it gives me a different size. It is not the size that I wanted to be. It's too small. I would at least want it to be the size of this. Maybe it's the size 1. I'm gonna copy this and show you 2 ways of changing that. You can highlight it and click on properties, type properties and click on it. And over here where it says height, I'm gonna change it back to 5. I'm gonna type 5 and hit enter, and it becomes 5 times bigger. Well, I think it should be maybe even a little bigger. I'm gonna make it 10 times bigger. So I'm gonna use the scale command. I'm gonna highlight my other text. I want to go to the scale, and that should be in the modify tab. Scale. I already have an object selected, so it tells me the point of my scaling. I'm going to scale it about its origin. Instead of 5, 10 times bigger. It's size 1. If I scale it by 10 times, it's going to be size 10. I'm going to hit enter. And this is not twice as big as that. If you notice, example 1A, the height is 10. This smaller one, the height is 5. I like this one. So next time I draw a text, this is multi-line, and I have that twice. But I'm going to go to the annotate tab and choose the single line. It tells me where to start. I want to start here. And because the last thing I drew, even though I changed it a bunch of times, I actually enter 1. This time I want to enter 10 because I know that I like that size. And I'm going to start typing. Ooh, it's asking me the angle. The angle is 0, so I'm going to hit enter because I like that. And then I'm going to type. And sure enough, it wants to go to the next line, and I enter another time, and now I'm happy with that. I think that covers everything we need to do. So remember, the last thing is to always draw around the origin. Once I'm finished with this, say this is all the work I've done, I'm going to move it far enough out of the way. And somehow I didn't peg the dimension there. Let me go right to left. I'm going to move it all out of the way. If you have trouble with this, is when you measure, I'm supposed to have that height there. And you can grab, if that dimension got left behind, remember we measure from this corner to the center. If you highlight the dimension and take that grip where it's supposed to be, which is the center, it will be fixed. Then the whole purpose of moving out of the way is so I have free space around the origin to draw the next. All your figures will be drawn on the same in the same file. You would just continue moving them out of the way until you're done with your 11 exercises or 10 exercises, and there'll be a separate file for the bonus. That's it. If you want to zoom in and see everything that you have drawn, you just double click the wheel and it zooms into everything you've done. That's all I've got. Good luck.